The blizzard hit Pine Hollow like a wall, the kind of storm that erases roads, muffles sound, and turns one bad decision into a wreck. I had already been plowing for more than 12 hours straight, running on coffee and muscle memory, when I turned into Aspen Ridge Estates, a gated, wealthy neighborhood with an HOA so strict it felt like they timed how long you could blink. They paid well, but everyone in town knew they were a nightmare to work for. I was crawling along, amber lights flashing, plow blade angled just right, doing everything exactly by the book. Visibility was almost nothing. Then, through the swirling snow, headlights suddenly burst out of the white. They were coming fast, way too fast for conditions like this. I slowed to a stop and hugged the far right edge of the road. The SUV fishtailed, the tires locked, and then it slid sideways and slammed straight into the front corner of my snowplow. The impact rocked my truck, but the real shock came after. The driver jumped out screaming, not once asking if I was okay, not once looking at the road or the damage. She pointed at me like I had personally offended her. Then she said the words that flipped my entire winter upside down. "I'm the HOA president. You're going to pay my deductible, or you're done here." If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Gone Wild, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? My name is Caleb Rourke, and I run a small operation called Rourke Snow Services. Winter is not just a season for me, it is survival. When the snow falls, that is when I make the money that carries my business through the rest of the year. Every storm counts. Every hour counts. And my truck is everything. If it goes down, I go down with it. That truck pays my mortgage, my insurance, my fuel, and the wages of the one-part-time helper I bring on during heavy storms. I maintain it obsessively because I cannot afford mistakes. Aspen Ridge Estates was one of my biggest contracts. On paper, it looked perfect. High-end home, steady payments, long-term agreement. In reality, everyone who worked in Pine Hollow knew the reputation. That HOA controlled everything. Not just the big stuff, but the tiny, soul-crushing details. Houses had to be painted within a narrow shade range. Mailboxes had exact placement rules. Trash cans could not be visible for more than a short window of time. Even contractors were treated like they were on probation from the moment they entered the gates. At the center of it all was Linda Ashford, the HOA president. Linda had money, time, and an ego big enough to fill the clubhouse. She was loud, confident, and absolutely convinced that the HOA rules mattered more than common sense. She loved reminding people who she was, especially contractors. I had dealt with her before. Emails written in all caps. Passive-aggressive warnings about compliance. Thinly veiled threats about contracts being reviewed. I tolerated it because the work paid well and because I did my job cleanly. My contract with Aspen Ridge was clear. I had approved snow routes, designated snow storage zones, and strict speed requirements inside the neighborhood. I followed them every single time. Those roads were narrow and winding, designed to look scenic and upscale, not practical for heavy snow. That meant plowing slowly, carefully, and methodically. I knew every curve, every cul-de-sac, every blind corner. I had plowed that neighborhood dozens of times without incident. That night, the storm was different. The snow was thick and relentless, driven sideways by wind that cut visibility down to almost nothing. It was the kind of blizzard that made your shoulders tense because you knew one mistake could cost you everything. I kept my speed low, lights flashing, blade angled properly just like always. I was doing exactly what the HOA demanded of me, nothing more, nothing less. When the crash happened, it was not sudden to me. I saw it coming in slow motion. I had already stopped. I had already moved as far right as the road allowed. There was nowhere else for me to go. When her SUV slid into my plow, my first instinct was concern. Accidents happen. Storms make people panic. I expected anger, sure, but also reason. That is not what I got. Linda did not ask if I was hurt. She did not look at the road conditions or the tire tracks. She did not even glance at her own vehicle before launching into accusations. She immediately blamed me. She immediately made it about authority, about control, about consequences. Standing there in the snow, with the wind howling and my phone already out documenting everything, I realized something important. This was not about an accident. It was about power. Linda could not stand the idea that something happened on her streets that she could not control. And instead of accepting responsibility, she did what she always did. She tried to push it onto someone she thought was weaker. While we waited for the police, she kept reminding me who she was. HOA president, board authority, contract holder. She talked about my deductible like it was already decided, like her words alone made it fact. I said very little. I took photos, the position of my truck, the angle of the plow, the snow buildup, the tire tracks leading into the impact point. I had learned a long time ago that arguing with people like Linda only gave them more fuel. The storm kept coming down harder as we stood there. My phone buzzed with messages from other clients asking when I would arrive. Every minute mattered, and she knew it. I could feel her using the pressure on purpose, trying to force me into agreeing just to get away. But I also knew that giving in would follow me for the rest of my career. That crash was the moment everything changed. What should have been a straightforward winter accident turned into something much bigger. A test of whether truth and evidence still mattered when they ran headfirst into ego and entitlement. And as I stood there in the snow, watching Linda glare at me like I had challenged her authority simply by existing, I realized this was only the beginning. The police showed up just as the wind started howling harder, snow whipping sideways under the streetlights. The Cedar officer Miguel Alvarez stepped out of his cruiser calm and steady, the kind of presence that instantly lowered the temperature of the situation. He didn't rush. He didn't take sides. He started doing exactly what I hoped he would do, his job. He asked both of us to stay put. He walked the road slowly, boots crunching through packed snow, shining his flashlight across tire tracks, measuring the distance between the curb and my truck, crouching down to look at the angle of my plow blade. He checked my warning lights, asked how fast I had been going, then asked her the same questions. I answered plainly, honestly. Linda, on the other hand, could not stop talking. She followed him step for step, waving her arms, pointing at my truck, insisting that I came out of nowhere. She claimed she had been creeping along, that she barely touched the brakes, that my plow was blocking the road illegally. Every sentence sounded rehearsed, like she had already decided how this story was supposed to end. At one point she clutched her wrist dramatically and said she felt a sharp pain shooting up her arm. 5 minutes later it was her neck, then her shoulder. She never settled on one injury, just kept listing them as if something might stick. I stayed by my truck and documented everything. Photos of the road, photos of the tire tracks leading straight into my plow, photos of my position fully stopped and tucked to the right. I took video too, narrating quietly to myself what had happened and when. I had learned the hard way that memory fades, but files do not. Officer Alvarez separated us and spoke to me privately. He asked again about my speed. I told him the truth, that I had already slowed to a crawl and then stopped completely when I saw her headlights coming too fast. He nodded and wrote it down. When he spoke to Linda alone, I could hear her voice rising, even over the wind. She did not like questions. She liked conclusions. After nearly half an hour, Officer Alvarez called us back together. Snow had already started filling in the tracks he had measured, but the evidence was clear enough. He explained it calmly, almost gently. My truck had been properly positioned. My lights were on. I was operating within my contract and within the law. Her vehicle, on the other hand, had slid after braking too aggressively for the conditions. Then he said the words that stopped her cold. She was being cited for driving too fast for conditions. For a moment, Linda just stared at him like she hadn't heard correctly. Then her face flushed red, and she exploded. She argued that she lived there, that she knew those roads better than anyone, that the HOA had authority over contractors. Officer Alvarez shut it down immediately. Authority did not change physics. Snow and ice did not care who ran the HOA. When he handed her the citation, she snatched it like it was a personal insult. She did not apologize. She did not calm down. She did not accept responsibility. Instead, she turned all of that anger directly at me. Her SUV had to be towed. My plow had barely a scratch. That difference seemed to enrage her even more. As the tow truck hooked up her vehicle, she walked over to me, lowered her voice, and spoke through clenched teeth. "This doesn't have to be a problem," she said. "You pay my deductible, and we move on." I told her I would be going through insurance. That was when the threats started. She reminded me she controlled the contract. She said she had influence in town. She said contractors who caused trouble didn't last long in Aspen Ridge. She framed it like she was offering me a favor, a shortcut, a way to avoid consequences. I refused. Her eyes hardened. "Then don't expect to work here much longer." Though Officer Alvarez was still nearby, and she knew better than to say more. But the message was clear. This was no longer about the accident. This was about punishment. I climbed back into my truck shaken, angry, and exhausted. My phone was full of messages from other clients wondering where I was. Time I would never get back. As I pulled away and resumed plowing, my hands were tight on the wheel, not from fear, but from the realization settling in. Linda Ashford was not done with me. She had lost control in front of a police officer, and people like her did not forgive that. They escalated, and as the snow kept falling and my truck crawled forward through the storm, I knew this wasn't just going to be an insurance claim or an HOA complaint. This was going to turn into a fight. I barely slept after that storm. By the time the sun came up, my body ached in places I didn't know could hurt, and my head was still buzzing from everything that had happened. I was halfway through cleaning ice off my truck when my phone chimed. An email. The subject line alone made my stomach drop. Emergency HOA board meeting. Contractor conduct review. It was scheduled for that same evening. No warning. No discussion. Just a formal notice accusing me of dangerous operation within the community. The wording was cold, deliberate, and already framed like a verdict. Linda's fingerprints were all over it. I knew exactly what this was. She had lost control on the road, lost in front of a police officer, and now she was trying to regain it where she felt strongest, behind a long table, in front of an audience, with titles and rules on her side. My contract, my reputation, and my income were all sitting in that email. So I prepared the only way I knew how. I treated it like a job site inspection and a court case rolled into one. I printed the police report. I organized the photos I had taken, labeling them by time and angle. I pulled out the signed HOA contract, highlighting the approved snow routes, speed limits, and operational requirements. I even printed my call logs and timestamps from that night to show exactly where I had been and when. By the time I was done, everything was neatly organized in a folder, so thick it barely closed. When I walked into the Aspen Ridge clubhouse that night, the room was already full. About 30 residents had shown up, drawn by the words, dangerous conduct, and emergency meeting. I could feel eyes on me as I took a seat near the back. Some people nodded politely. Others avoided eye contact. Linda stood near the front, talking loudly, dressed like she was heading to a press conference instead of a neighborhood meeting. She started as soon as the meeting was called to order. She talked about fear, about safety, about how she barely survived, a reckless contractor barreling through their streets in a blizzard. She held up photos of her damaged SUV like evidence in a trial. At one point, she wore a wrist brace that I had not seen the night of the crash. Her voice cracked at just the right moments. She had clearly practiced this. For a few minutes it worked. People murmured. Heads shook. I could feel the room tilting against me. Then it was my turn. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't insult her. I didn't match her emotion. I simply stood up and laid everything out. The police report showing she was cited. Photos of my truck stopped and positioned to the right. Tire tracks showing her vehicle sliding into me. The contract clauses I followed to the letter. The timeline of the storm and my route through the neighborhood. As I spoke, the noise in the room faded. People leaned forward. Board members started flipping through the copies I handed out. Questions shifted from, "What happened?" to, "Why are we even here?" That was when Linda's tone changed. She interrupted, waved her hand dismissively, and said she was willing to be reasonable. She said accidents happen. She said she didn't want this to turn ugly. Then she looked directly at me and said it. "If Caleb pays my deductible," she said, "we can put this behind us and allow him to continue working here under review." The word, "allo," hung in the air. I felt something click into place in that moment. This wasn't just intimidation anymore. It was leverage, public leverage, and she expected me to fold in front of the entire room. I didn't sit back down. I said calmly, clearly, and loud enough for everyone to hear, "That's not a compromise. That's extortion." The room went silent. You could hear the heater kick on. Someone dropped a pen. I explained that paying her deductible would be admitting fault for an accident I didn't cause. That my insurance existed for a reason. That threatening my contract, unless I paid her personally, crossed a line. I wasn't emotional. I wasn't aggressive. I just named it for what it was. Linda's face went tight. She laughed nervously and tried to walk it back, saying I was being dramatic, that she was just offering a solution. But it was too late. People were looking at her differently now. Board members exchanged glances. The performance had cracked. She gathered her papers, announced that she would take this further, and stormed out of the room. After she left, no one spoke for a long moment. Then, the board chair cleared his throat and apologized to me. They said no decision would be made against my contract, and that they needed time to review everything properly. A few residents even thanked me for keeping the roads safe during the storm. I walked out of that clubhouse knowing one thing for certain. Linda Ashford had just exposed herself in front of her own community, and people like her never accept that quietly. The shift was subtle at first, but once I noticed it, I couldn't unsee it. After that meeting, people stopped looking at Linda like an unquestioned authority and started looking at her like a liability. As Evan Whitaker, the treasurer, was the first one who didn't follow her out of the room. He stayed behind, flipping through the police report again, brow furrowed. Melissa Grant, the secretary, asked me quietly for a digital copy of my photos so she could attach them to the meeting notes. Those were small things, but in an HOA, small things mean everything. Over the next few days, emails started changing tone. Messages that once came straight from Linda suddenly came from the board. Language shifted from threats to neutral phrasing. No one said her name out loud, but it was clear that some of the board members were creating distance. They weren't defending me yet, but they weren't backing her either. And for someone like Linda, that alone was an insult. I made a point to explain my side calmly whenever asked. I walked Evan through how insurance works, how liability is determined, and why paying a deductible out of pocket is essentially admitting fault, even if it feels like keeping the peace. I told him that once you give someone like Linda money to make a problem disappear, it never actually disappears. It becomes a tool. Melissa nodded the entire time. She already knew it. She just needed it said out loud. Linda, of course, did not take this well. Within a week, I was served papers. Small claims court. She was suing me personally and my business for her deductible, medical expenses, and something she labeled emotional distress. The total amount wasn't enormous, but that wasn't the point. The point was to drag me, to intimidate me, to show me that she could still make my life difficult. At the same time, the harassment began. I got a notice from the city claiming someone had reported an oil spill on Aspen Ridge roads. When inspectors showed up, they found nothing. Then came a noise complaint about my truck operating outside approved hours, easily disproven. Then a police officer knocked on my door one evening responding to a report that I was trespassing in the neighborhood while plowing under contract. He checked the paperwork, apologized, and left. Every complaint was baseless. Every complaint wasted my time. Linda never contacted me directly again. She didn't have to. She used paperwork, systems, and authority like weapons, hoping I would crack under the pressure. But by then, I had already made my countermove. The morning after I was served, I called my insurance company. I didn't rant. I didn't speculate. I laid out facts. Timeline. Evidence police report. Meeting transcript. Within a day, they assigned me an attorney named as Nathan Cola. He wasn't flashy. He didn't talk fast. He listened. That alone told me everything I needed to know. Nathan asked for everything. Every photo. Every email. Every complaint. Every log. He didn't just want the accident. He wanted the pattern. As we went through it together, even he paused a few times, quietly noting how quickly Linda escalated once she didn't get her way. "This isn't about a crash," he said. "This is about control. We built the defense carefully. The police citation established fault. The photos supported vehicle positioning. The medical claim raised red flags because Linda hadn't sought treatment immediately. The HOA meeting recording showed her offering to drop the issue in exchange for money. That one, Nathan said, was particularly interesting. Meanwhile, Linda kept pushing. Fake reviews appeared online, calling my business reckless and dangerous. Nathan documented every one. Another complaint went to the city claiming my business license was invalid. It wasn't. Each failed attempt stacked up, not against me but against her. The strange thing was how calm I felt once everything was documented and in motion. For the first time since the crash, I wasn't reacting anymore. I was responding. Linda had momentum, but I had structure. She relied on pressure. I relied on records. One evening, Evan called me quietly. He didn't say much, just that the board was concerned, and that some things Linda had done were being reviewed internally. He didn't elaborate, but his tone said enough. The board wasn't united anymore. Cracks were spreading. Linda thought filing a lawsuit and flooding the system with complaints would scare me into paying her. Instead, it handed me something far more valuable: a clear trail, a timeline, proof of behavior that couldn't be explained away as a misunderstanding. As Nathan put it, people who are right don't need to chase this hard. And for the first time since the blizzard, I allowed myself to believe that this fight might actually end in my favor. By the time the second week rolled around, it felt like Linda had made it her full-time job to make my life miserable. Every few days there was something new. Another email, another notice, another knock at the door. She wasn't hiding anymore. She was flooding the system, hoping that if she created enough noise, something would eventually stick. First came the online reviews. Overnight, my business pages filled with one, Star ratings from accounts that had never used my services. The language was dramatic and vague, calling me reckless, dangerous, a threat to the community. One even claimed I nearly killed a family during the storm. Nathan told me not to respond to a single one. Screenshots only. Dates, usernames, timestamps. Let them speak for themselves. Then the police calls started again. One afternoon, while I was finishing a plow run in a different neighborhood, an officer pulled me over and asked if I was authorized to be where I was. Linda had reported that I was trespassing in Aspen Ridge without permission. I handed over my contract. The officer radioed it in, confirmed everything, and let me go with an apology. He wasn't annoyed at me. He was annoyed at whoever kept wasting police time. The city complaints were next. Reports of property damage that never happened. Claims that my truck leaked fluids on HOA roads. Accusations that I violated noise ordinances during restricted hours. Inspectors came. They looked. They left. Every report closed as unfounded, and every single one went into the file. Nathan kept telling me the same thing. Let her dig. The more she pushed, the clearer the pattern became. This wasn't concern. It wasn't safety. It was retaliation. The real breakthrough came when Nathan reviewed her medical claims more closely. Linda had submitted paperwork listing wrist, neck, and shoulder pain, all tied directly to the crash. On the surface, it looked serious. But when Nathan requested the actual records, the timeline told a different story. Linda hadn't gone to a doctor that night. She hadn't gone the next day either, or the day after that. She waited several days before seeking treatment, long after the accident. That gap mattered. In cases like this, timing is everything. Delayed treatment weakens causation, especially when someone is already threatening financial demands before any medical evaluation exists. Nathan flagged it immediately. This changes things, he said. While all of this was happening, the HOA board went quiet. No emails, no meeting notices, no public statements. At first, that silence worried me. Then Even called again, carefully choosing his words. He said the board was conducting an internal review. He didn't say of what, he didn't say of whom, but he didn't need to. I later learned they were looking into expenses Linda had approved without full board consent. Legal consultations, investigation costs, filing fees, all tied to her personal dispute with me. Money that didn't belong to her, spent without transparency. The same behavior I had seen from the start. Authority treated like a personal weapon. As the court date approached, everything felt compressed. Every action Linda took seemed more frantic than the last. Another complaint, another threat, another attempt to scare me into settling. But the pressure wasn't crushing me anymore. It was focusing everything. Nathan organized the case like a timeline you could walk through step by step. The crash, the police citation, the HOA meeting, the demand for money, the lawsuit, the harassment, the delayed medical care. Each piece reinforced the last. Nothing stood alone anymore. The night before the hearing, I sat at my kitchen table flipping through copies of everything we planned to submit. It was strange seeing it all laid out like that. What started as a single moment on a snowy road had turned into a paper trail thick enough to tell its own story. Not my story, hers. Linda believed power meant never having to stop, never having to admit fault, never having to back down. But pressure works both ways. And as the days counted down, it was clear that everything she had thrown at me was now coming back, lined up neatly, waiting to be examined under a judge's calm, unbothered gaze. Whatever happened next, it wouldn't be decided by threats or titles. It would be decided by facts. The morning of court arrived quiet and clear, almost mocking after everything that had led up to it. No snow, no wind. Just cold sunlight reflecting off the courthouse windows as I walked inside with Nathan at my side. My stomach was tight, but my head was clear. We weren't walking in to argue. We were walking in to present facts. Linda arrived 10 minutes later, heels clicking loudly across the tile floor like she wanted everyone to notice her. She was dressed sharply, hair perfect, posture rigid with confidence. A wrist brace was still strapped on months after the accident, and she made sure it stayed visible. She barely glanced at me, but the look in her eyes said everything. She still believed this would end the way she wanted. When we were called in, the courtroom was small and plain. No drama, no spectacle, just a judge, a clerk, and two sides sitting a few feet apart. Judge Harper Lowell took the bench with an expression that suggested she had seen every version of this story before and wasn't impressed by any of them. Linda spoke first. She was polished, emotional when it suited her, indignant when it didn't. She described the storm, the crash, and her injuries in vivid detail, painting herself as a cautious resident blindsided by a reckless contractor. She spoke about fear, pain, and how her life had been disrupted. At one point she glanced at me and shook her head, as if disappointed I had forced her into this. The judge listened without interrupting, hands folded, eyes steady. Then it was our turn. Nathan didn't raise his voice. He didn't challenge Linda directly. He simply walked the judge through the record. The police report showing fault. The citation issued at the scene. The photos of my truck fully stopped and positioned correctly. The tire tracks leading into the point of impact. The contract outlining my authorized presence and procedures. Then he moved to the medical records. He pointed out the gap, several days between the accident and any medical treatment. No emergency visit, no urgent care, no immediate complaint. Just a delayed appointment after demands for payment had already been made. The judge leaned forward slightly at that. Nathan finished by submitting the HOA meeting transcript, where Linda offered to drop the issue in exchange for personal payment. Not as an accusation, just as part of the timeline. The judge looked down at the documents for a long moment, longer than Linda seemed comfortable with. Then she looked up. She asked Linda a simple question: why she didn't seek medical treatment right away if she was injured. Linda stumbled through an explanation about delayed pain and being busy. The judge nodded once, then asked another question: why she paid the traffic citation instead of contesting it if she believed she wasn't at fault. There was no good answer. Judge Lowell didn't lecture. She didn't scold. She simply stated her ruling clearly and without emotion. The evidence did not support Linda's claims. The burden of proof had not been met. The case was dismissed in its entirety. Just like that, it was over. Linda sat frozen for a moment, like she hadn't processed the words. Then her face tightened, and she gathered her things sharply, refusing to look at anyone as she stood. The clerk called the next case while Linda walked out, the sound of her heels no longer confident, just loud. Outside the courtroom, she finally turned on me. She stepped close, voice low and sharp, telling me this wasn't finished, that I'd regret embarrassing her, that people like me didn't get away with things like this. Nathan stepped between us instantly. He told her, calmly and clearly, that any further contact would be documented and addressed. That continued harassment could result in additional legal action. That the court had ruled, and this was over whether she liked it or not. For the first time since the crash, Linda said nothing. She turned and walked away, shoulders stiff, head high, but something about her pace told me the truth. She hadn't lost quietly. She had lost publicly. And people like Linda never recover from that the way they expect to. As Nathan and I stepped out into the cold air, I felt something lift that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. Not triumph, not revenge, just relief. The kind that comes when the truth finally gets the last word. The court ruling didn't stop Linda. It exposed her. Within days of the dismissal, the pressure she had been applying to everyone else finally turned inward. The HOA board, already uneasy, now had something they couldn't ignore: a public loss backed by documentation that made her behavior impossible to defend. What had once been brushed off as Linda being Linda suddenly looked a lot more like abuse of power. Avon called me first. His voice was careful, almost tired. He told me the board had finished its internal review. What they found was worse than anyone expected. Linda had authorized payments using HOA funds for legal consultations, filing fees, and investigative work tied directly to her personal dispute with me. Thousands of dollars spent without full board approval. Community money used to pursue a private vendetta. That was the breaking point. An emergency meeting was held without Linda present. By the end of the night, she was removed as HOA president. Her access to HOA accounts was frozen, and a formal demand was issued requiring her to repay the money she had misused. When she refused at first, the board involved legal counsel. Faced with that reality, she backed down. It didn't end there. The false police reports caught up with her too. The department had records. Repeated calls, repeated claims, each one disproven. She was fined and placed under restrictions for filing false reports, warned clearly that further misuse of emergency services would carry serious consequences. For someone who thrived on authority, being told no by multiple systems at once was a kind of collapse. The neighborhood changed after that. People who had once avoided eye contact started stopping me while I worked. Some apologized outright. Others thanked me for keeping the roads safe during the worst storm of the season. A few admitted they had always been afraid to challenge Linda and were relieved someone finally stood up without backing down. The board formally reached out the following week. They apologized for how I had been treated and acknowledged that I had acted professionally at every stage. They renewed my contract on the spot, this time with clearer language protecting contractors from individual board member interference. Avon handed me a bonus check, calling it a gesture of good faith and regret. I accepted it not because I needed the money, but because it represented something more important: recognition. Work went back to normal, but it didn't feel the same. I plowed Aspen Ridge with the same care I always had, but now people waved, drove slower, gave space. The fear was gone, replaced by something closer to respect. Linda stayed out of sight. Word spread that she was trying to sell her house, that she had lost standing not just in the HOA but in the wider community. Authority once stripped doesn't grow back easily. For me, the biggest change wasn't financial. It was internal. I didn't feel like I was bracing for impact anymore. I knew how to protect myself. I knew that documentation, patience, and refusing to be bullied worked, even when it was exhausting. Winter wound down. The snow melted. I kept working, took on new clients, hired extra help. The same truck that Linda tried to turn into a liability carried me forward instead. The storm had passed, and with it, the illusion that power always wins. By the time winter finally loosened its grip on Pine Hollow, everything felt different. The snowbanks shrank, the roads cleared, and so did the tension that had followed me for months. Work picked up in a good way. New contracts came in. I hired another set of hands and started planning for a second truck next season. Even Aspen Ridge felt different. When I rolled through those same winding streets again, people slowed down, gave space, and waved instead of staring like I didn't belong. Linda didn't stick around much longer. There was no announcement, no dramatic exit. One day her house was listed, and not long after that, she was gone. Just another name on a forwarding address. The power she clung to didn't follow her, and neither did the fear she used to control people. Looking back, the lesson is clear. Bullies don't rely on truth. They rely on pressure, shortcuts, and the assumption that no one will push back. The moment you refuse to panic, refuse to pay for peace, and start documenting instead, their power starts to crumble. Evidence doesn't raise its voice. It just waits. I didn't win because I was louder or stronger. I won because I stayed calm, kept records, and trusted the process even when it was slow and exhausting. That experience didn't just protect my business. It changed how I carry myself. I know now that standing your ground doesn't have to be dramatic. Sometimes it's quiet, methodical, and unshakable. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Gone Wild. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?